Hi everybody, I'm Lydia and welcome back to my sewing channel. From my first video, which was a pattern haul, I had a big list of patterns that I recently got at the Butterick and Simplicity sale that Joann's did, and I decided that for my first real video, my pattern review, I wanted to pick one from that list, and I ended up going with Simplicity 9311, the vintage style apron, and I'm gonna do view A, the one that, as I stated in the original pattern haul, that I think looks like a dress rather than an apron, but I'm sure the assembly is much more simplistic than if it would be a garment. I've looked through the instructions, and the it has bias binding all around the neck, the armholes, all around the bottom here, which I'm sure going up into those little scallops is going to be a little fiddly. And the back is completely closed. So, you know, again, much like a dress, buttons and a bow there. So it calls for 2 5/8 to 2 7/8 at 45 inches with a nap. And the fabric I ended up choosing does have a directional print. I'm going to use this cotton that has been in my stash for, oh, 7, 8 years. I'm not even sure where I got it. I cannot remember. It might have been one of those $1.50 a yard value fabrics that Walmart used to sell years ago, or I might have gotten it off of eBay. The name on the selvage says Lisa Liffick Designs 2006. Ooh, that might be older than I thought. Honey and Me Incorporated. So, So I washed all of this today, ironed it, and for the contrast, the bias binding and the bow, I'm just using a solid brick red that matches the red in this. So next step will be looking through the sizing and seeing what we've got going on there. Okay, so this is the way I tend to trace out my patterns when they're modern. Of course, I would never do this to a vintage pattern. I like to use regular white paper that comes in these big rolls at the craft store. They're usually in the children's craft section because they're meant for, you know, kids to color on or whatever. So they're really cheap. I think this is like 50 yards of paper and it was $10. But it's thick. You can't see through it. So you can't lay it on the pattern and trace from above. So I do it this way. I'm doing the size small, right? So I'm gonna take a marker and just do this the whole way, because it's going to bleed through just enough that when I lift the pattern, I'll be able to, you know, see the marks, and then it's traced out. And even though it is damaging the pattern, it's minimal. I mean, it's not like I've cut it. And I actually think this method is better for the longevity of a pattern than using a tracing wheel, because a tracing wheel creates perforations. It creates this perfect weak spot in the tissue paper where now it just wants to rip. So marking better than the wheel in the future, at least I think so. So a quick check-in. I finished tracing out all of my pieces for the size small, uh, which I would have done anyway, but I should have checked the finished garment measurements for the waist before I did that, because they were not printed on the tissue paper, which is unfortunate. I mean, why wouldn't they be printed on the tissue paper? In fact, okay, and on the back of the envelope, it says chest and hip printed on pattern tissue. The finished hip is not printed anywhere on any of the fabric tissue pieces. So the only finished garment measurement that you're given is the bust. But I went ahead, I measured all the pieces at the natural waist, and the size small comes out to a 26 finished waist, which is absurd because the size small says that it's for those with a waist of 25 to 26 and a half. Well, if you have a 26 and a half waist, you're not even going to get it button closed. Even if you have a 25-inch waist, the thing is going to be uncomfortably tight. An inch of ease in the waist is like, you know, prom dress level ease. It's kind of absurd. So luckily I did that. There are 7 seams on the waist, you know, each side of the front, side, back, and whatever. So I'm going to add 0.3 inches to the side of each of those seams, and that should get me up to a 29 and a half, which will be a comfortable amount of ease for me, and would still, by the way, would be right in the middle of what they claim the medium should fit. So yeah, this pattern runs very small in the waist. So I'll get to that, and then I'll actually cut out the fabric pieces and we'll get this assembled. Now here I'm just tracing out the ties and getting ready to cut them, and then I'll use the rest of this 1 yard of fabric to cut the bias strips. Now, as you probably already noticed, the film keeps bouncing in and out of focus there, which I didn't realize at the time because I was using my rear-facing camera on my phone, so I couldn't see the screen, and I didn't know about the whole autofocus thing that happens. I'm still brand new to this whole video making thing, and so I figured that out, and next time I will definitely remember to turn off that autofocus feature so it's not constantly trying to refocus on me every time I move closer to the camera. I am bound and determined to figure out this whole video making, video editing thing and get it right. One of the things I think a lot of us sewists out there have experienced is the inexplicable matching up of patterns when you didn't mean to do it. In this case, when I was cutting these pieces, I was making no effort at all to match the stripes, match the pattern, because I had so little fabric that I wasn't even going to attempt it. But luck being as it was, since so many of the pieces were either cut right on the selvage or cut right on the fold, they ended up matching up beautifully in the end anyway, through no conscious effort of my own. So that was a nice little happenstance. Now here I'm just applying the stay stitching to the round neckline, and after that going to add the long gathering stitches to the bottom bust areas. I'm one of those bad sewers who will very often skip stay stitching, but I've learned my lesson when it comes to bias binding edges. If you're going to have a bias bound neckline, you really do want to stay stitch it first, because applying the bias tape is already going to risk that whole bagging out stretchy thing. So anything you can do to help mitigate that on yourself is definitely worth it. At this point in the video, you can see there's a lot of shaking, and so it looks like the camera is shaking, but actually the camera's not on the table or touching it. It's on the tripod next to the table. It's the table and the machine that are shaking. I have one of those plastic fold out tables, and it bounces horribly while I'm sewing, and I've never been able to figure out a way to get that to stop. Now, this is an interesting step. The second part is the formation of the pockets, which involves placing piece 4, which they're calling the pocket facing, onto the back of piece 5, and this will eventually become the pocket once the third piece is attached. Now, they're calling it the facing, and the instructions have you cutting it out of the fashion fabric, but it's really not necessary. I mean, it's inside the pocket. The top here is going to be all bound in the bias tape, so none of this is going to show at any point. So I guess I didn't need to be too concerned about the fact that I almost ran out of fabric, because I didn't need to cut these out of it anyway. For step 3, we're forming the pockets, which are, you know, from the image on the outside of the pattern, it almost looks as if the pocket would just extend all the way down to the hem. I mean, good thing it doesn't. So when you do this step, you'll want to do the bottom of the pocket first, just by itself, and then lay it down and stitch up the sides. And also whatever finishing you're going to do here, because the instructions, there's nothing in the instructions for any kind of seam finishing. So you do have to keep that in mind as you go through the steps. If you were to go ahead and stitch up everything, then coming along after the fact to finish this would be kind of a pain. So here you see the pocket formed on the side front. This is the way it looks on the inside and the way it looks on the outside. Comes together pretty well, and it's about the depth of your hand. It ends just at the bottom of my palm there. So okay, this is gonna be kind of difficult for me to get it into the whole shot, but so I have the front portion assembled, and I think the sizing might actually be working out okay. I was surprised because the medium, it says that the finished chest is a 42, which, you know, I'm only a 36, so that's a lot of space up here. So, but I think once the back is attached, this is actually going to be pretty, it's going to be pretty tight. But I guess that's the aesthetic we're after. So onto the back portion. Oh, and you can see here's where it's gathered on each side up to the top. And at first, when I was looking at the pieces, I was pretty sure I might have to extend this, but you know, now that I've got it sort of pinned on, I think it falls right about in a good place. So next part is assembling the back skirts, and then they have you attaching the shoulders and doing the collar, and then they want you to do the sides, which is good because if there's any gaping at the sides or fit here, I mean, just altering at the side seam would be easiest. Here we see the two back sections all assembled with the back dart and the two back skirt panels. The center backs have self-interfacing. It just folds over twice. And if you're using a regular quilting weight cotton, that gives you more than enough thickness for the buttonhole, so there's no need to add extra interfacing there if you're using something at least that heavy. And the next step I have is to connect the shoulders to the front section and then bind the neckline. Now we're just hemming the tie pieces, which just calls for a narrow hem on the three sides. And then this end will be scrunched up a bit and buried into the side seam of the apron at the natural waist. So I'm just going to do this by sight, finger pressing. Now I am stitching up the side seams so that the front is now attached to the backs. And one thing it did not cover in the instructions, but I would recommend, is that on the hem of this garment, all over where you're attaching the seams, stop your stitching a 1/4 inch from the bottom. Because when you go to bind that big scalloped edge and you have to turn that corner, it's going to be much easier if that seam allowance is open. Okay, so for me, the fiddliest part of this project is the bias binding on the hem. It's going up into these little, the high points of the big scallops. It's a little fiddly. I've looked at several different methods online of how to do this where, you actually sew a seam here and it's like triangle shaped, and I didn't want to go through all that because the angle isn't nearly that sharp. If I was doing like a hard right angle or something, I'd probably go through all that trouble. But this is just pressed over, like barely just a little tuck, and it seems to work just fine. So I'm going to keep doing that the rest of the way and then top stitch down as close to this edge as I can. I did try earlier to do stitch in the ditch instead, and I think I just don't have the motor control to pull it off. I cannot keep the needle in that ditch. It keeps bouncing out and it looks ugly, but I do seem to do okay keeping it right on the edge though. So that's what we're gonna do. And wouldn't you know it, I completely forgot about the armholes. They need to be bound too. So let's do that. Luckily I made plenty of bias binding. Okay, it's button choosing time. I am torn. I had nothing red, but I do have these sort of bronze, like meant to look like dirty gold buttons, and I think they go okay. And I happen to have just enough of these left for this. Most of my projects use a lot more buttons than this, so this is like button remnants, which would be good to use those up. The alternative would be kind of like plain coconut shell. So, I'm torn. I'm thinking these might be a little bit too fancy, and the pattern doesn't go with this pattern, and they kind of clash, but this is matching the like country aesthetic I got going on here. I realized that I chose a 1950s apron pattern, and then the whole aesthetic of everything after that really doesn't match the 50s. You know, their big thing then was all pastels and light colors, and I'm going kind of, I don't know, 19th century rich tones with it. But I like it. I think I'm going to go with the coconut shell. Okay, wait, I lied. These are much better. Yep, definitely going with those. Well, everything is finished, and I think it came out pretty well. Hopefully you can see. I can't get entirely in the frame, but it's good pockets. I was going to leave off the belt, but I'm glad I didn't. I would say the only change is that it is a bit baggy up here, but you know, then again, it is an apron. They have it sized with the intention that you're going to be wearing it over clothes. But, you know, if that was their plan though, they should have made the waist bigger, because from the underbust down, it's very form-fitting. Very much so. Like, I went ahead and I made the size medium, even though I initially traced out the size small. After I did all that tracing, I had a little rethink of it, and I was like, you know what, I'm gonna have to increase the waist so much on these pieces. It's just not worth it. Just go ahead and make the medium, so the size is already there. So I went ahead and I made the straight medium, no size changes. And it fits pretty well, except the bust is just a tad baggy, but that's just because I have a very small cup. They say that the finished bust is a 42 for the medium. I went ahead and measured the pieces. It's 41.5, close enough. The finished waist is 29.5. So I mean, that's a pretty big, you know, bust to waist ratio there that they're doing. It's pretty small. But my measurements are 36 and 28.5, and the medium fits just about perfectly. So next time, I mean, if there is a next time, I could easily just get away with taking this in at the sides, or actually no, just taking it in at the middle and then gathering less. So other than that, it came together pretty well. I like it. So, well, there it is. That's 9311 View A. And here we are outside, which is definitely better lighting than my little hobbit hole sewing room. I'm quite pleased with how it turned out. And wouldn't you know, an apron that was designed to be worn over a dress does indeed look much better over a dress. I especially like that I chose a collar.